Well, Route 6 has a lot of memories for me in many ways. Driving down Route 6 towards Provincetown has always been what's going to happen today, what's different, what's new. And back when I did a fair amount of hands-on marine mammal stranding response and starting in the 90s, it was always a surprise. You always learnt stuff and you always made mistakes. And the balance is always going to be, did we make progress? Or did we mess up? Did somebody get hurt? Did we piss off somebody in the government? What are we going to do about what we just learned? And how does this relate to broader relationships and the science and the politics of marine mammal conservation, which, you know, became my real interest? And, you know, how's this going to sit with the guys in Provincetown, you know, because the history of stranding response on Cape Cod has a lot of debt to Stormy Mayo here and Dave Matilla as well, in terms of really turning around the attitude of how to manage these animals. So it was always an excitement and a trepidation, but I was hoping there would be snow on the dunes, and there wasn't. Because those dunes, when they're fully white, are like heaven on earth. Now, what can we do? And that's really become the question, is what can we do to fix the problem? Well, we know that they're not going to get entangled if there isn't rope in the water column. We know they're not going to get hit by ships if the ships are going slow enough or not in the wrong place. And so it's been a sort of a pragmatic evolution from the discovery of what's going on, the fact that the mortalities that we've documented are excruciatingly bad, especially the entanglements, in terms of animal welfare. Even though we as consumers don't mean to kill whales, we are whaling by mistake, because killing a whale is just to ensnare it or trap it or kill it. And, you know, were we to not be consuming goods that were brought by ship, seafood that was caught with ropes and nets and traps, those mortalities would not be happening. And so our consumer ethic, or lack of, is directly driving the mortality and the sublethal damage that we're causing, and the animal welfare horrors that are being brought upon these animals by our consumption.
It's really interesting how your career spans the ending of whaling and then the addressing of new problems, which are problems entirely fixable. Entirely fixable. And isn't it ironic that your measuring of time to death brings you to this point that the acute animal welfare thing is the way these animals are dying. And they take a long time to die, don't they?
They do, and the word acute is interesting in terms of the spectrum of acute to chronic, because actually entanglement death is most commonly a chronic event. It's not an acute event. And, you know, vessel strikes are usually acute. Harpoons are peracute. You know, the vessel strike animals usually die within a few hours. The average time to death for an entangled right whale, if it's lethally entangled, is around 5 to 6 months. And to this day, I remain bemused, befuddled, and depressed by the fact that we cannot have some red line that we should not be crossing. And I think that chronic entanglement is way beyond what is acceptable in a humane, thoughtful society. So by definition, we're not humane, we're not thoughtful in that context. and we've published a lot of case material about similar animals, trying to build the storyline that what I just said is not just one animal. And it's been incredibly depressing, because however you say it, whether you say it in the scientific literature or you say it in the popular literature, whether it be an op-ed in a newspaper or in a book, and say all of these things, and you even say, well, no, we've got all of these solutions here that we can deal with this. Where are we at? Entanglement's just as bad or worse than it's ever been. And so that's a very significant challenge, and it's a challenge to one's own legacy, and not my own alone. I mean, many of us who meet every year at the Right Whale Consortium and the Ropeless Consortium have the same I'm actually doing very similar things to what my parents did, although they were serving suffering humans. My mother ran the business for my dad and his partners, and she also was a trained nurse. And her early days before they got married was as a maternity nurse in a London hospital during the Second World War, pushing people under beds while they were in labor because the V-bombs were dropping all around. So she knew stress, she knew trauma, and she told me all about that. And that never left. But my dad, he was ministering to suffering people, and his methodology was to get to know the people in their homes and their environment. And he was from a time where he would gather a deep history of these people, because he knew their families and he knew which buildings in the community were damp, and so were most likely to have, because he'd been in them. He was more likely to be able to diagnose on the basis of their history than you are today, who they never get closer than the computer screen. They rarely touch the humans.
Exactly. There's no context.
There's no context. And that, I think, I learned from him. I remember him telling me when I was a teenager, oh yeah, that whole family got pneumonia because their buildings are damp. And that really struck with me as a veterinarian, to recognize the value of a history. And the beautiful thing about the right whale story is that the history has been cataloged. Individually recognizable animals, and when we find a dead animal, one of the first things I do is, once we've identified it, is to assimilate into the story, the case reports, what we've known, if we do, about the history of the animal, how many times it's hit by a ship, how many entanglements were, because that all plays into the depth of which we can get into its story. And we're telling stories, in trying to tell that story. I mean, I focused mostly on dead animals, but also if you want to understand why right whales are suffering from a lack of calving productivity, you also have to understand what ails the living animals. So the sublethal trauma is as important, if not more so, than the lethal trauma. And so your average entanglement, the energetic cost of that is proportional to about the same scale as the cost to create a baby whale. Not to suckle it, but to deliver it. And so that gives a pretty clear perspective on how these entanglements impact reproductive success. Yeah, the first entanglement right whale that I worked on in any depth was an animal called 2030, and this was about 97, something like that. And it was a particularly nasty entanglement. And it was the first time I'd really understood how bad things were. 2030 had gill net wrapped around both armpits and over the back. and the head rope had dissected off the blubber. So it was still alive, swimming with a big patch of blubber missing. And Stormy and Dave Matilla were up in the Bay of Fundy, and I was there too. I was asked to try and inject antibiotics into it. And so I spent quite a lot of time waiting for them to fail to disentangle it. And I wasn't going to subject it to the drugs and the whole injection thing unless they had a chance it was going to live. And that didn't happen. So I actually didn't go to the necropsy, but I worked up the case, from the desk point of view quite closely, and it became the poster child for me of these entanglements. Yeah, right. Well, last February, a right whale washed up on Martha's Vineyard, and we were able to work with the local Wampanoag tribe in Aquinnah, Gayhead Wampanoags, and they actually took the carcass, and the necropsy was done there, the animal was buried there, and the bones were saved, the baleen was saved, and the Native Americans legally are allowed to profit from the artwork that they can create from that. And I think this is probably the first time in this part of the world that due respect was given. And it was really neat to be part of that. It's not a personal thing, but it's a corporate thing of the progress we've made in getting rope out of the water column, at least in theory, by using this on-demand fishing gear. And the reason why it has worked as well as it has was the depth at which we got into meaningful, respectful, collaborative relationships with the stakeholders. So to this day, if I walk into Sandwich Marina and walk into the lobstermen that we've worked with, the family, because they were shut out of the fishery, and they know that I put my fundraising skills and my science skills on the line to enable them to get back to work. And that's pretty huge. I had a retirement party and they all came to my party. Well, coexistence is dependent upon a willingness to share the cost of not traumatizing these animals. And so to do that, the stakeholder industries have to be either regulated or driven by market forces to adopt the necessary mitigation measures. And so this little thing of mine here is a very primitive attempt to try and illustrate or describe the circle of death. So that then leads back onto an impact on the species, and it goes around in a circle. And the speed at which that circle spins, or if it spins at all, depends upon the relative, influence that the stakeholders have versus the conservationists have. And because our society runs on money, and money talks, the right whales are not a particularly good money source. They don't generate anything except, and not even whale watching because they're not allowed to go near them. So the right whales are pretty much powerless, with the exception of the conservation, animal welfare, science lobbies that push the information. And we go down to Washington and we talk, and especially in the Republican-dominated process, the producers are lauded for their contribution to society. And the scientists and the conservationists are seen as parasites because we're being paid by the government to do our science, and we're standing in the way of progress. I gave a presentation to a hearing at a House committee on fisheries and whales and stuff. I literally, by the end of it, wanted to ask the Republican chair, can you tell me where the train to the Gulag is, because I really think that's where you want me to go.
The right whale, you just touched on it, is almost unique as well because we have no use for it. You can't display it, you can't watch it. It's a cryptic animal. Its movements are cryptic. Stormy Mayer once said to me, said a couple of years ago, the humans have no bridge to the right whale.
Right, which is why I've been trying to get good video.
Yeah.
But you know, there's a wow factor, but there's no emotional connection.
No.
And that's the challenge.
No.
Humanity, like for humanity history, losing the right whale under the watch of the richest country in the world.
Right. Well, I think the answer is that it's symbolic of a much broader loss of biodiversity that's going on worldwide, and obviously the consumer demands of the richest country in the world are an outsized piece of that problem. But reality is that when our grandchildren stand on Herring Cove Beach and look out and see nothing, and there's no more seafood, then they're going to say, well, what the hell were you guys thinking? And it's not just about right whales, it's about biodiversity in general. And it will impact the sustainability of the human species as well before very long. And when they're gone, and it won't be a great earth-shattering event. It'll just be that they're not around anymore. It's kind of like when you knock a house down in a neighborhood. It's really hard to actually think about the way it was when it was there once it's gone, because it's the new norm is right there. There's an open piece of ground, or there's a bigger house there, or whatever. And you know, I mean, I think around our neighborhood where a lot of houses have been knocked down and rebuilt in the last 20, 30 years, and you have to really struggle to remember the norm that we've lost, and that's true globally in biodiversity.
It's the size of the right whale and the copepod on which it feeds seems to encompass the scale of the problem.
Yeah.
And you have an animal which is like a dinosaur. It has the most bizarre aspect, the features to it. But it has a benevolence to it as well because of its seeming placidity. And because it's going on, and it just makes that link between the vastness of a threatened climate, of a threatened global entity, and us as the copepods in a way. And it's like the scale of what the whale represents. It's no coincidence that the whale is so present, all the creation myths of peoples around the world. And in great books like from Moby Dick to Paradise Lost, you know, to Free Willy. And our relationship to these animals, it's so, fucked up, because we can't make the connection, and we can't make the connection between our love for the animals and the fact that that love is killing them.
Well, one of the things I've tried to do is to document their, you brought up the topic, reproductive methodology, because right whales are very unusual in the complete absence of aggression in how they reproduce. You know, there's no butting of heads. All they do is they have a, you know, what's the best way to describe it?
Orgy.
They have an orgy. Yeah, I think that's probably about right.
Hours and hours of foreplay.
Yeah, lots of play, and it's all quite gender independent too.
Yeah.
So, you know, and all this is fueled by things the size of a half a grain of rice. And, you know, I've tried really hard to document more of that, and it's not easy, but we haven't done well yet because it's rare. But you see more when the species is doing, when there's more food. So